This is Antic, the Atari Baseball podcast.
My good friend Dan Pliskin wrote a tune called Disco Dirge that we programmed into the Rotberg Synthesizer, the earliest version of the Rotberg Synthesizer, to play at the bachelor party as kind of a joke, because Chris Dowden, who was getting married, was a disco fan. He was a disco buff, and we all hated disco.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Ed Rotberg worked as a programmer in the coin-op division, where he worked on Atari Baseball, Battlezone, Blasteroids, Hard Drivin, and other coin-op games. He consulted for the Atari consumer side, where he created demos for the Atari 800, including working on the music for the in-store demo and the Rotberg Synthesizer music software. Check the show notes at AtariPodcast.com for downloads of the Rotberg Synthesizer and Rotberg scrolling marquee software, which I acquired and uploaded to archive.org after this interview took place. This interview took place on April 28, 2015.
Why don't we start by can you tell me how you got started, how you got hired by Atari?
A co-worker of mine, I was working at the time for GD Searle Pharmaceuticals in a suburb of Chicago. And a coworker of mine, I was always into games and programming things in games, using the computers at work and things. And this was before personal computers got very big. And a coworker of mine handed me an ad from InfoWeek about a job opening for programmers at Atari. So on a lark, I sent in my resume. Mm-hmm. And eventually I got a call from one Steve Calfee, who was a manager in the coin-op division of Atari, and he interviewed me over the phone. And then a few days later, I got an invite to meet him at O'Hare Airport for an interview. Mm-hmm. I went down there, wearing suit and tie and the whole thing, and I go in there, and he's wearing a polo shirt and blue jeans. And so I think what actually got me the job was the minute I opened the door and met him, first thing I did was take my tie off and say, thank God. So I think that's what got me the job more than anything else.
Nice. At the airport? Because he was flying from place to place or something?
Yes. He was at a hotel at O'Hare Airport.
Oh, interesting. Cool. So you were hired by the coin-op division?
Yeah.
And what was your title?
Game programmer when I, hired on. That was it. Mm-hmm. I started programming games.
Okay. What games did you start to program?
Well, the very first game I did, Atari had a very successful football game with X's and O's on a tabletop thing with 2 trackballs. Mm-hmm. It was called Atari Football, and they wanted a baseball game that ran on the same hardware. So, this was all done in 6502 assembler. And I am an absolute baseball freak. I go to spring training every year. So I jumped at this and came out with a game, done in about 3 months. It was called Atari Baseball. We actually took some time in there to do the first game voice synthesis, which never made it into the final product. And my copy of the game had the prototype board in it, but that went to, a few years ago, went to Dale Luck. He took it off my hands out of my garage. He's a member of the California Extreme Group. Mm-hmm. And I don't know to what extent he resurrected the pulse code modulated audio board that Dan Pliskin created for the game. But, it was done. It was an okay game. It was my first video game.
Nice.
Commercial video game.
Mm-hmm. What else did you work on?
Well, the next game I worked on was Battlezone.
Oh, love the Battlezone.
So that was our first attempt at doing a 3D game. There were actually 2 games going on at the same time. One was being done by Rich Moore, who did Lunar Lander. Mm-hmm. He was familiar with the vector generator, but had not worked with and done any 3D stuff before. And then I did Battlezone. One of the guys had created a bit slice processor for doing the 3D math involved. And we ended up using, instead of doing your traditional 3x3 or 4x4 matrices, we were very challenged for processor time in those days. And Battlezone really only needed it's basically a 2D game, except for the projections. But even then, you don't need, if you know that you're you can take shortcuts and not do a full 3x3 matrix transform, instead do a 2x2 matrix transform, which is a lot fewer operations on process on instruction challenge machine. So that's what we were doing. There was a little bit of cheating and pre-calculation going on to make things look more 3D. All the projections were true 3D. So in a way, it was true 3D, except all motion and transforms were only done in 2 of the dimensions. So nothing actually rotated. They rotated around the conventional y-axis. That was really about it. Nothing rotated, nothing rolled or yawed. Is that right? Rolled or pitched?
Right.
It was rolling or pitching.
It would only yaw. So like the enemy tanks would turn left and right.
Right.
That was it. They wouldn't go up or down. They wouldn't.
Correct. And when you blew up a tank, it looked like the pieces were tumbling, rolling, and yawing and pitching at the same time. But that was a trick by rolling and pitching the pieces, and then just start them yawing, and it looked like they were tumbling. They actually only yawed in real time.
You're tricky, and you've ruined my childhood. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. It's all we could do that much. It was.
Is it true that the military commissioned a special version of Battlezone?
It wasn't the military as much as a group of retired generals were proposing to use the technology that went into Battlezone in a training simulator, and so there was a version done to work as a simulator for the gunner position in an infantry fighting vehicle, a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. If we're going to get specific about it. And, we went and we saw the fighting vehicles, got to sit in the gunner's seat and the whole deal. And the controller used for that was actually turned up to be the controller used, a modified version of it turned out to be the controller used for a number of different Atari games going forward. The actual controller had not only finger switches, it had palm switches and thumb switches, and it was used in Star Wars most famously. But it was used, the full version of that controller was used for the simulator.
What other games did you work on?
I did a game called Blasteroids, which was to be an update of Asteroids,
right.
Using raster hardware instead of vector hardware. I worked on a game called Steel Talons with Ed Log. I did some work on hard driving. I did the music code for that, all the ability, because I'd done the Rotberg synthesizer way back when, and this was an updated, more advanced version of that for hard driving. I did Stun Runner, which was another 3D driving game. I did a Shoes bar top game, which was a horseshoes game, which I still think to this day was just a total fun, cool project. I was impounded to work on a game called Guardians of the Hood, which I had no interest in and was supposed to be working on something else. But that was part of the reason I left Atari. The last time I left Atari, I was there for actually 2 separate stints. There may have been other games I worked on, but not as a major contributor.
So as a guy in the coin-op department, how did you end up doing consulting for the Atari 800 and software development for that?
Well, Atari was kind enough to get, the programmers in the coin-op division, Atari 800s at a very reduced rate. And, hey, this was my first personal computer, and I could do all sorts of development on it. I wasn't particularly interested in doing, basic programming, which is what the Atari 800 came with. So there was another language running around at the time, still around actually, used in some astronomical programs, called Forth, which I used to drive some assembly language code, which I also wrote for the Rotberg Synthesizer, because it needed to be fast. These were very slow machines. And I did some other demos and things on the Atari 800, and it's a funny story, because I was just doing this for grins on my own. No one was asking me to do any of this stuff. Although at one point when I had put a lot of these pieces together, they asked me to put an in-store demo together, or pieces for an in-store demo together, which I did for them. And I was friends with some of the sales and marketing people in the consumer group. We had two divisions, the coin-op group and the consumer group. Mm-hmm. And when they introduced the computer over in Europe, they asked if I would go along as the technical consultant, which pissed off a lot of the programmers in the consumer group greatly. I got a free trip to London and Paris and Montreux, Switzerland, which was fantastic. I got to meet Claude Nobbs, who was the director and founder of the Montreux Jazz Festival, and over the course of 3 days there, I wrote a special program for him to use on their marquees at the festival, so that was kind of cool and fun.
Is that the Rotberg scrolling marquee?
Yeah, that was for the Montreux Jazz Festival and at Claude Nobbs' request.
So tell me more about that, because I couldn't find any information about it other than the name.
Well, it did use the Rotberg synthesizer, and played a couple of tunes that I had already done. So that was 3 days. You can only do so much. But it allowed them to, it had a little editing program that allowed them to have a two-way marquee that scrolled a single message horizontally across the screen. At the same time, behind it would scroll a vertical thing, and they could edit in whatever they wanted into either of those two, change it at any time. So they could put up, some message like, so-and-so playing right now on blah, blah, blah stage, and they could have the list of people coming up on the current stage, and they could have a different one at each, various venue that they had going on there. So, it wasn't a whole lot of stuff, but like I said, it was done in 3 days. So
yes.
That was kind of cool.
Do you know if that still exists anywhere, that software?
I honestly have no idea.
Okay. The in-store demo is pretty much my favorite program for the Atari machines. I've already interviewed Mike Alba about it.
Mike's a great guy.
Sorry?
Mike is a great guy.
Yes. So how were you involved with that? Integrating your synthesizer into it?
Yeah, I integrated the synthesizer into it, and I think there was one other module. I don't even remember all of it. This is like 30 years, so I don't even remember all that went into it, but I think I programmed up another part of it as well. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't even, I'd have to probably watch the whole thing and go, oh yeah, I did that, because I couldn't tell you what at this point.
All right, so we're kind of going out of order, but I'd like to talk about the Rotberg synthesizer, kind of how it came to be. You wrote an article about it for Antic magazine, and then that was kind of reprinted in Softside. So please tell me everything.
Well, I've always been an avid music fan and wannabe musician, and when the Atari 800 came out, it came out with an audio chip in it called Pokey, which any aficionado should be familiar with, and this allowed you to produce 4 channels of audio. Mm-hmm. But they were just, like crude square waves and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. If you could control the amplitude and frequency of those in real time, you could do some much more significant things. So this required, a program in the background making dynamic changes to the Pokey chip on all the channels as it was making the sound, like changing the envelope. So the amplitude envelope, the volume envelope, so you could make it sound like a piano with a hard attack and a soft, slow decay. Mm-hmm. You could make it sound like a guitar or a harpsichord or whatnot just by doing the amplitude. If you wanted to make it sound more like a Moog synthesizer doing portamento, then you would be controlling the frequency in real time as the things went. And you could also do percussive sounds and all kinds of things. So there was a lot of time spent playing around, coming up with different instruments, envelopes. And what the Rotberg synthesizer did was it provided a framework for being able to dynamically change any of these parameters on the Pokey in real time in a structured manner. And by using tables of what needed to change at what rate, you could define a clarinet or a guitar or an oboe or a bunch of different sounds. It was somewhat limited, and you had to use your imagination. So having put together this framework, it was actually the earliest version of it, a very crude version of it, was done. One of the guys was getting married. One of the guys in the Atari Coin-Op group was getting married, and there was going to be a bachelor party. So my good friend Dan Pliskin wrote a tune called Disco Dirge that we programmed into the Rotberg synthesizer, the earliest version of the Rotberg synthesizer, to play at the bachelor party. As kind of a joke, because Chris Dowden, who was getting married, was a disco fan. He was a disco buff, and we all hated disco. So that was the original impetus to create this program, which wasn't called the Rotberg Synthesizer at the time. And then, I had the pieces, and then I said, all right, let's put this together in a much more usable fashion. And so I did that. So it was much more general purpose, and started transcribing some music directly for it. I transcribed a number of tunes. Ravel's Bolero, I recall, was one of them. I think I did. I can tell you one of them was Jean-Luc Ponty's New Country, which I almost got into a lot of trouble for. I got a nasty letter from his lawyer saying, you're reproducing this without permission, blah, 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 blah. Good news was I forwarded a letter to Claude Knobs, who was the director of the Montreux Jazz Festival. Mm-hmm. I said, I'm not selling this. This is just like, a fun thing I did. I'm not trying to make any money off of this. Can you contact? And he took care of the whole thing. I never heard from him again. Mm-hmm. So that was great. That's where it helps to have contacts, I guess.
Looking at the version that I could find online, there was New Country, Prelude and Fugue in C minor by Bach, and then Disco Dirge. There's no Bolero in this particular version, but
there is a version of Bolero somewhere around. I remember distinctly poring over the score and trying to determine, all right, which voices can I leave out, which are essential, that kind of thing. Which ones can I kind of cheat and quickly go back and forth and make this channel do clarinet, oboe, and flute, all alternating whichever one is most important at the time. And it took a long time, but it was pretty cool. I'm surprised that's not around anywhere. Too bad.
How did you enter this data?
Well, see, this is kind of interesting. At the time, there was another guy writing a synthesizer for the Atari 800 computer, and he did it mostly in BASIC. His name is Lee Actor. I eventually hired him into a company that I had helped found. It was called Vidya at the time. As a programmer, after I saw this, he included a whole editor for doing this stuff. I basically used a macro language, for C#, would put a hexadecimal value in put out a hexadecimal value, and you'd give the octave, so C#1 would be a very low value. C#5 would, be 60 decimal plus that up to get you that number, and then you would also program each channel as to, you'd had something that would give you a rest. You would have something that would indicate the length of a note when you struck the note. You would set up the channel with a volume and an instrument, which pointed to other things. So it was basically a bunch of macro files that you used to generate the, if I remember correctly, you would program the music in. So it wasn't the wonderful editor that Lee Actor made for his thing. Mm-hmm. So I was so impressed with it, I hired him. Lee Actor is now an internationally known composer, classical music composer. He's done some marvelous stuff. He worked for me at Vidya and then at Bally Sente, and then got into music composition full time. Well, not immediately after that. He worked with Dennis Coble at Polygames for a number of years, where they made quite a bit more money in the consumer market. So he was able to go off and pursue composition, which is what he studied in college full time.
Nice. In your article in Antic, it said something about this Rotberg synthesizer has been passed around in dark corners of dark alleys. Was this really something that kind of got passed around Atari and users groups and or whatever before it saw the magazines?
Oh yeah. There were a lot of people who asked. I mean, the guys in consumer group say, "Hey, can I get a copy of it?" And I whipped together a document on how you program it and things like that. So, and they, I'm sure they were passing around to their friends and such because I didn't. It was a fun thing for me to do. There was never intention to leverage into any kind of real product. That was too much work.
Sure.
And it's part of the reason why when I wrote the article for Antic, I broke down how I did what I did and why I did what I did, as opposed to slapping down a bunch of code. Mm-hmm. Because if you slap down a bunch of code and something breaks, you have no idea what's going on. If you explain intricately each and every step of the way, and then how I implemented, to get that feature and to make that work, and the understanding there, then someone who's competent can do it, and someone who's not competent can find a buddy who is.
I think I have a half answer to this question. I was going to ask the in-store demo plays Disco Dirge slower than your synthesizer, standalone synthesizer. And your article indicated it had something to do with there is velocity, tempo information in the synthesizer files, but the in-store demo doesn't use it because it's timed to the vertical blank. I know we're reaching way back in the tech stuff. Can you talk more about that? Do you remember anything about that?
Vaguely. The key is that you've got to, you have to have a constant, call it an interrupt, but the synthesizer itself has to run at a constant rate, so we can know, how much to vary, and what that rate is determines how much you can vary an amplitude ramp or whatever you're doing, an amplitude curve or a frequency curve or whatnot. The vertical blank is very convenient in some ways because it's there for every program because it just is. But it's also where a lot of other stuff for video goes on, for video related things goes on. So you only have so much time. Right. That's part of the reason that the very kernel of the synthesizer is written in assembly language and really crunched down, and a lot of tricks used to do things very quickly so that you use as little time to make the changes as possible. A lot of stuff was table driven for that reason, to reduce the actual calculation needed. Because calculation is slow, table lookup can be very fast on a 6502. So you can also, if I remember correctly, program an interrupt on Pokey. So you could go at a 4 millisecond rate, for example, as opposed to the 16 millisecond rate of the vertical blank interval. And that would, give you 4 times the resolution in your curve, in your waves, your your amplitude. What they used to call those things? There was a name for them.
The envelope?
Yeah, they were envelopes, but there was a name for
ADSR.
Yeah, ADSR envelopes, right.
Attack, decay, sustain, release.
Right. So that's why you could have much more resolution in those, and you wouldn't hear quantization as you were changing the volume slowly on a release. You wouldn't hear it go down to a lower volume. The coarser, the more infrequent your update rate, the more you would notice that.
I was unaware of the technique of pokey interrupts. I've only heard of interrupting Antic. Cool.
Well, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was just something you programmed into Pokey to generate an interrupt at a particular time rate.
Did you do any other software for the Atari 8-bit machines?
I'm trying to remember. I had one for the longest time, and I used to love to program it for all kinds of different things. But for the life of me, I did some early software for them on the outside. In other words, to digitize images, so you could put up digitized images, at as high resolution as was supported on the display. I'm pretty sure I helped program a few games and things here and there, but it's hard to remember. because it was, for the most part, I was not doing anything commercially for the 800 at all. It was all either someone would ask me or I was just, messing around to have fun.
Right, sure. The video digitizer seems intriguing.
Yeah, that wasn't done on the 800. It was done to create a file that we could use on the 800 to display. That was done with some of the stuff we had in the coin-op lab.
I saw that you used Ataris to make some of the sounds for the movie Tron.
Yeah, there you go. That's another thing I did. And I guess that was for a commercial thing, although I did not get paid for it. I did get a credit in the movie.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's in there, and there are some scenes that were cut out where I had contributed audio. A number of the audio samples that I created for the movie were done with the 800, the Atari 800, using the Rotberg Synthesizer and just straight coding for some really bizarre things. And then actually when I went down there for a visit once and I was messing around in the audio labs of Frank Serafini, who was the lead audio guy, I believe, for that, using his Moogs and delays and things like that, I actually created another sound that they used for when Cindy Morgan and Bruce Boxleitner were like using their hands to drink from some water that they found, and the water made this really weird sound as ripples, and that was another sound effects I had in there. And it wasn't a ton, I think there was only like 3 or 4 total, and they probably cut 1 or 2. I don't know. But we created, in order to give them 3 or 4 total that were used, created dozens, so.
Sure. Wow. Neat. Can't believe they didn't pay you. Disney, man. What are you going to do?
It was, this was all fun back then.
Yeah. Still fun. What haven't I asked you that I should have?
Gosh, I don't know. What do your subscribers want to know about? I mean, what kinds of stuff are they interested in?
We cover all aspects of the Atari 8-bit stuff, and I certainly don't mind wandering off into other things like coin-op when it's interesting. You seem to be filled with interesting stories, so you're welcome to tell me anything about your time at Atari, the people you work with, the culture there.
Some of that's best left unrelated. But in a very succinct manner, I can say that the group of engineers I worked with at Atari and the coin-op group to this day is the single most talented group of people I've ever had the pleasure of working with, including Mike Alba. And I'm still friends with most all of them. A lot of them, a good number of them, come up every year to an annual golf tournament I hold up here where I live now in the foothills of the Sierras. And my wife refers to it as a celebration of bad golf, which is probably accurate. But we have a lot of fun. Just phenomenal people like Ed Logg and Dave Toyer, Rich Adam, Owen Rubin, all these guys I still keep in touch with, and including a number of guys from the consumer group like Rob Zadibble and Bob Smith, so there's a large list of those people. Dennis Harper's another one from the coin-op group, and we've all worked back and forth for each other over the years. It's kind of fun to have gone through that. The last thing I will say is that, specific that I think your people might want to hear about is what an incredible machine the 8-bit processors were, in particular the 6502, which I'm most familiar with, although I did do 8080 family programming quite a bit. In fact, I started with that. But it's, in a way, it's sad for me today to a certain extent, and while I understand it and can't really argue with it, that students in computer science and computer engineering really don't learn assembly language on any machines anymore. And the reason I say that is because there is, and I don't call it an art, there is a certain level of knowledge and familiarity you get with Boolean logic and Boolean arithmetic when you work at the hardware level that you do not get, that you're insulated from when you're strictly working in higher level languages. That serves you very well when you're trying to do space and or speed optimizations, when you're trying to get the most out of a machine that you can, and just for understanding what is actually happening when I do this complex statement in C#. What's going on underneath the surface? Is this making a mess of things, or is it elegant? And I've seen that with the younger people that I've worked with, guys who, and this is not to take anything away from them. They're really, really bright people, and I've learned a ton from them. So that on that level, it's great, it's cool. But when doing simple things like trying to determine if a number is even or odd. For example, I'm thinking of one specific instance. A really delightful, brilliant programmer I worked with took a rather circuitous route to solve that problem. When there's a very efficient, fast route that we all knew offhand, because this is the kind of stuff you were doing all the time.
Right, modulo 2 or something,
see, that's right. That's what he did. Modulo 2, absolutely wrong. Just and it with a 1. That's the fastest way you can do it. Modulo doesn't divide. You don't want to do a modulo anything. But this is the kind of thing that, when you're working day in and day out with assembly language, you realize, this is the fast way to do this. So, and the other problem with modulo, and this is something for a lot of your users, is that, in fact, it is implemented differently in different languages and in the same language on different processors, different compilers. Will implement it differently. Like what happens when you modulo a negative number? It's different on all of them, and so the result you get will be different. Whereas if you just stick with masking the low bit off, you will get a consistent thing across any compiler processor matchup. So it's one of the pitfalls. You pointed it out right there. It thinks modulo 2. It's logical. It makes sense. But when you think about what goes on in a modulo operation and the decisions that the compiler writer has to make with things like negative numbers, you realize that's not the best solution.
On this episode of Antic, Kevin gets told by Ed Rotberg.
No, I didn't mean to put you down there. It was a perfect example, and it's the logic. It's the first thing that pops into your mind. I totally understand why someone would come up with that first, and it's exactly the example that I brought up. So, yeah, it just worked out. I'm sorry. Sorry you had to take the run.
No, I'm here to learn. Here to learn from the experts. It's great. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been nice meeting you.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.